These are some of the things that you need to kind of ask yourself in this initiation stage. Why are you doing this project?
Yes, I think the ideal goal from the project initiation stage is more have a honest, realistic understanding version of the project.
Welcome to a new season of Projects in Focus. I am the host, Reece Dempster, and if you like our approach of passing on the lessons learned of project managers across our industry, please like, subscribe, and tell a friend. And this will help promote our podcast, attract new guests, and bring you better case studies. We are back to the initiation stage of a project yet again. To many, this is a mysterious stage where projects just pop out of nowhere, but which I personally enjoy. And through my experiences and my studies, have seen a lot of projects being set up for success, but equally have been set up to struggle. Today, we are diving into the human element of behaviours, biases, and heuristics that are throughout the initiation stage, as we explore some of the information that is available with a well-known Perth project, the Perth Children's Hospital. To help us dive through the behaviours, biases, and heuristics, and explore this in the context of the Perth Children's Hospital, we have ECU Senior Lecturer and Researcher, Eden Lee. Eden and I have crossed paths many times over the years, and most recently, we have found a shared interest in people's behaviours, biases, and heuristics within projects. Eden was recently awarded the International Project Managers Association Global Young Researcher Award for her outstanding contributions through her paper, A Dynamic Skills Framework for the Future of Project Management in the Digital Era. Eden and I will discuss a little bit of everything today. Insight into the mysterious world of how projects start, the human elements that have the biggest impacts, and the key deliverables that signal the end of initiation and the beginning of planning. I hope you enjoy it, but most importantly, Eden, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Reece.
So tell me a bit about what does initiation mean to you?
Well, I think project initiation is a stage where you turn this abstract idea into something really concrete, having a project come into shape or form. I think that's a quite critical stage where something abstract becoming something concrete.
Yeah. And how do you go about that? Or what are some of your experiences that you've undertaken in the initiation stage of a project?
Yeah, I think essentially what project managers or project management team trying to do during the initiation stage is trying to have a concrete project business case developed as a final product from the stage. As in, as a project manager, how you get all the essential important people in the room, getting people's understanding about their expectation towards the project, as identifying all the important stakeholders and getting the scope written down on paper so that we can all agree upon this is the initial scope we discussed before, and talking about all the potential risks and surfacing out what we have thought about before and what we haven't. So these are all the essential steps we do during the project initiation stage. So as a result, from all of those activities, we'll have a good, well-developed project business case in the end.
Yeah. And you've hit on quite a few little elements there. One of the key things that I find in that initiation stage is that benefits conversation. What benefits do we really want? Yeah. And you start exploring that.
Yeah.
Some people do skip over that, but there's an actual key element in the initiation stage is what is the priority of benefits and how do you achieve that?
Yeah.
What's your experience in that?
I think that all stems from a good conversation with the key stakeholders, understand what each different stakeholders' expectation about the project benefits, how do they expect project to deliver benefits for them, and the way scoping down the project, making sure that project will actually deliver things that each project stakeholder was looking for. So it's really having this honest conversation with all the important people, important stakeholders in the room, making sure that we are working on this, which is sort of a realistic, sort of moving towards direction all we agreed upon.
Yeah, and it's easy said, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
it's something that we're going to dive into today. But it's not an easy conversation.
No,
it's a hard one.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things all happening at once.
Yeah,
and we'll dive into that a bit.
Yeah.
So we were talking about some of the key elements that lead into a business case. Now, Personally, I don't see the business case as the end artifact of initiation.
No.
What is your version of an artifact that kind of ends the initiation stage?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned that project business case is not the end goal from project initiation stage. Essentially, what a business case should represent is a shared understanding. I would say that is more realistic understanding about project, not in a version that this is the ideal version. We're trying to get the project approved, get the project move on going so that we have all the sort of discussion, have a perfect project business case developed so that we can get sponsored. Move the project. Rather than that, I think the ideal goal from the project initiation stage is more have a honest, realistic understanding version of the project. What are the benefits we're trying to deliver and what are the actual risks we have discussed and we haven't think of. Having those mindset, balanced view of the project is quite key, I think.
Yeah, and some of the key artifacts that you can capture that in is some of the ones that I've worked with, project charters, project risk registers, kind of identifying from a high level. Because remember, benefits are opportunities. So risk registers are both ways, what can impact your project and what's an opportunity for your project, as well as kind of doing a high level benefits analysis versus your costs. In infrastructure world, there's always usually about numbers, but in some other projects, so society is like, do you get to put a valuation on it, or is it a capability that you need to establish? And these are some of the things that you need to kind of ask yourself in this initiation stage. Why are you doing this project? And what makes this the right project to do?
Exactly. I think, as you mentioned, a couple of questions we want to ask the team is that, what are we committing to? Are we ready to do this? What sort of effort required from us to do that? And who is responsible for which part of the project? And that's tap onto the accountability thing and what are the risks involved. All this honest conversation I want to have discussion among the team, which is quite important to have, especially at the initial initiation stage.
So I'm going to take you back to your teaching environment. So when you're talking to students about the initiation, what is some of the things that you do to introduce this part of a project?
I try to, starting from at the beginning, I want to give students an overview about project life cycles. So what are the different stages of project life cycle students need to remember, and what are the important, why project initiation is important, and what are the significance of this? What may go wrong if you did some mistakes or if you didn't start well from the beginning. So that's the conversation I want students to start to imagine why this is important and how we should approach this if this is so important.
What element do students kind of resonate when you're talking to this? Do they gloss over, or do they just go, I just want to get to delivery. I don't want to talk about initiation. What happens in the classroom?
Because we teach project initiation for undergraduate, first year undergraduate, so majority of them haven't got any real life project management experience. So what they know is from the knowledge from textbook. So knowing that project initiation stage is the first stage before we're doing all the project. So I don't think they have a deep understanding about the importance of this. So that's why in classroom, we're trying to incorporate some of the case studies, meaning that if we have done wrong, or if we have some of the things, if we haven't considered during project initiation stage, there might be consequences. So in that way, we're trying to introduce the significance of project initiation stage.
So how do you start introducing the human elements of behaviours to students in that context, or to any people that you kind of engage with? How do you start introducing the human elements of initiation?
I guess project initiation stage is a very interesting stage. As we mentioned earlier, this is quite a abstract stage. You don't have a project yet, as in you don't have a building yet, you don't have a contractor yet. Everything is sort of uncertain, it's up in the air. So we're starting to discussing possibilities here. So I think it's a human nature that when it's quite empty, quite abstract, human brain try to bring the gap with the best case scenario. That's the optimism. We're trying to imagine what could the best case. Sometimes we do that. We don't realize we're doing that. So that's a situation where potential psychological bias might kick into a situation. That's why I think project initiation stage is one of the most important stage, only because everything is uncertain, but there's huge gap potentially for psychological bias to creep in.
There is. And, like it's an element in terms of any abstract discussion. Humans want to have the optimism, or they want to have themselves confirmed right. They want to have validation. So when you've got any type of project that there is some sort of emotional attachment or moral judgment, there starts to be some really different views on how projects can be delivered. We experience them on daily basis, and even today in our case study, we'll get to talk a bit about that. One of the things that I kind of have read a little bit about was some of the confirmation biases that the biases that you have actually explored. What can you give us some of the biases and environments you've explored them in?
Yeah. That's a really interesting conversation, Reece. I did my PhD in psychological bias in construction dispute negotiation. So I did study a couple of taxonomies of psychological bias, which have high potential to affect decision-making during project negotiation or project dispute resolution. A couple of examples I can give you. First, as you mentioned, the confirmation bias. As in, people tend to imagine a situation, tend to make assumption. And once people formed an assumption, the later information stage becoming a process of you collecting conforming information to confirm what you have thought of so far. As in, you're basically trying to collect supporting evidence to support your existing assumption. And all the opposite evidence, you try to downplay that. So that's the one behavior of confirmation bias. Another is potentially anchoring bias. As people try to form a decision based on the early evidence they collected, based on somebody during the first meeting throwing a number or throwing an idea. People tend to use that as a reference point, and all the later information they collected will be measured against that reference point. That's the anchoring bias. Another might be authority bias, as in we judge the credibility of information based on the source of information, who provided that information, rather than what's the content, the cognitive information. So that's a couple of examples of psychological bias might be high potential to affect human decision making.
And they're very interesting papers that you've written, and I have read 3 of them, isn't there?
Yeah, a couple of them.
Yeah. So in terms of the context, I really liked what you said about the anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is not unique to the construction or the delivery stage of a project. It's human nature. And it's one of the things I actively motivate or actively encourage people is to never give a single number. Is that when projects, especially in the initiation stage, is to have a range. When you're talking about numbers or dates, have a range. When you're in the initiation stage, talking years, 2029. Or if you're in the dollars and you need to talk about, it could be approximately, always round up, even if it was 1.1, you say $2 billion. Always round up. If it's at the moment it's past 1 or 1.09, it's $2 billion. All right, especially in early conversations, because when you're anchoring those numbers that are talked about earlier, they are anchors, and they are anchors in your stakeholders' mind. They are anchors in your sponsor's mind. So if you've got a project and you've got a sponsor that's saying, hey, this is what would this be like, I won't hold you to it. They will hold you to it.
They sort of have a power, sort of will shape and form how we think laterwards.
Yeah. And it's not that it's a bad thing.
No.
It's a human thing, a very human element of projects. And we just have to lead through it is kind of how I feel. So when we're in that initiation stage, we've talked about a couple of biases that are known. What are some other biases that play big parts in that initiation, that early stage to you?
Yeah, I think on top of the couple of types of bias we already discussed just now, another interesting one is called psychological endowment.
Yep.
As in, if you spend certain amount of time in the early stage, you make the time to do your plans, do your draft, do your Gantt chart, do all sorts of effort. And after you have an early version of the plan, you sort of think that I have invested into that. I spent efforts doing that. You establish a sense of ownership of that. And then later on, we try to define that. When you're presenting this to, for example, external stakeholder or different people, you're trying to guard this version of your planning. So that's an interesting fact called psychological endowment. As in, you consider this is part of your ownership. You're trying to define this version of planning. You think this will hold true. This will be how we play out.
Yeah, and one thing that I think that plays huge into that is that I've recently kind of diving into this world is where you've got to remember that you have the knowledge.
Yeah.
You have the information, you have all the data, and you're presenting or you're trying to convince or influence people that they need to make a decision based on your recommendation. But you have the information. You need to kind of pitch yourself as a perspective where you don't have that information and you got to present that. And that is not an easy skill to do. And that's where I think that psychological endowment really kind of gets its foundation from is because people can't put themselves in a position where they're like, oh, you don't know anything about what I'm presenting. How do I, influence you when I have all the information and you don't, but you have all the power and I don't? And that's kind of the conversation of that I see play out in practice. Does does academia ever dive into that kind of element as well?
We did have a paper looking at the impact of psychological endowment on rational conversation. As a result, psychological endowment can become a huge barrier towards rational discussion, especially when people think that they have invested into their ideas, into their version of a plan, and adding the difficulty for people to accept different ideas, causing more and more barriers to achieve these two-way constructive conversations.
It is. It becomes, you can see, the Australians go, you're going to die on a hill about this. They hold on to their perspective, even with all their information, but they can't take another perspective. And that, the psychological endowment could be a sunk cost element. I've put, 10 years of my life onto this. I'm not changing. There's other elements that drive that. But that perspective does remove the chance for rational conversations. Have you ever experienced this in the working environment in your career so far?
Yeah, even in classroom, we have all those sorts of examples. So in classroom, we're trying to do more interactive teaching. So I give students different case studies to work on. So some of those, they spend 20 minutes in class to develop a group plan. And when we're trying to introduce some conversations across different groups, it's very hard for students to accept different opinion from different groups, only because they have spent certain time working on their version, as in they think their version, they have ownership towards their version. It's very difficult for their version to be sort of rejected. Even students is quite apparent. I can imagine this sort of a psychological empowerment will get strong. My personal understanding that this type of bias will getting stronger, especially people are more senior as you grow in your experience or seniority. Because you have this one way of thinking, and as time goes by, this pattern of thinking, this way of thinking got more validated through different evidence, through different cases, through different examples. You have this established framework, which becoming more and more difficult to be challenged.
Well, and that's not unique to projects. That's a human politics, thing. That's basketball, football. You put a different shirt on other teams and they're like almost like, I'm not going to touch you. They're like, you barrack for that team. I'm not, you look at Yankees and there's some really interesting rivalries out there, even though they're all playing the same games. They're all projects, they're all sport, they're all politics, they're all trying to govern for the best of Australia, but we still have some very different views of what that is. And projects are not immune to that environment. But one of the things that I feel is that there is, like you said, there's less of a rational conversation around that bias because of the seniority in that project environment. No one's going to challenge, the senior person that's just said, oh, we're going to do it this way. It's just like, okay, well, let's do it. You've said it's all on you. And it's having the conversation, especially in larger projects where you have the ability to have a conversation, that should be actively encouraged in kind of that space. So we've been talking about that cognitive bias in the initiation stage. What are some of the activities that you've seen that have overcome that? What are some of the practices that you've seen or have heard of that can overcome some of these biases?
Well, essentially, I think, as you mentioned, psychological bias or cognitive bias are part of human nature. So I don't think we can 100% fully eliminate those bias, but we can, using some structural governance or structural intervention to mitigate those sort of bias as much as possible. For example, one thing I can think of doing is introduce some structural changes into a group, team, adding one team member or dedicate one team member to play the role of devil's advocate. As in, if the people in your team play the role of devil's advocate, the team member is attributed with the responsibility to searching additional information or opposite information, and then in your team meeting, you're having this healthy, positive debate, which helps a lot. But this will happen based on the condition that you have the level of psychological safety in your team. As in, people are relatively comfortable, feel safe to do that. And this particular person are responsible to bring in different ideas, opposite ideas against the team. So that's why you can have this constructive conversation. So one way is having this devil's advocate player in your team, which is quite key. Another way is bringing some independent, like for example, independent professional or auditor to your team to your team later on during the stage, to bring in this pair of fresh eyes into your team. Because what happens usually is that after you have spending some time with your team to discuss the conversation, you'll develop this group thinking, as in all the team thinking the same direction, will be moving toward direction for a while. So using an external pair of eyes to bring in some fresh information could help.
And bringing the fresh eyes to the project is something that I have done, and I've done through a particular activity called a pre-mortem.
Yeah.
We all know what a post-mortem is. It's gone to case study, hindsight. This is we can all do post-mortems. But pre-mortems is where, you take the risk register, you take the 3 top risks or the 3 highest risks, and then you put you look at the consequences of those. And then in the workshop, you start with, this is the newspaper's headline, consequence realized, and then you ask, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And then you start thinking about it from a negative point, not from a negative point of view, but from a constructive, active, what was the pathway that achieved that outcome? That is the pathway you just avoid. It's identifying what not to do in a project together. And sometimes people I've seen are going, we're about to do that. And we're like, well, now that you've identified the pathway that happens to this outcome, how do we avoid that pathway? And it's like, we just take a little left here and then we're on a completely different pathway, but we're avoiding that risk and mitigating in an appropriate way. And that was one of the activities that I've seen as a pre-mortem. And that is an active, interesting conversation, especially when you take that perspective of, we all failed. This is the headline of the newspaper. How did we get here? And then start using that in the workshop. People are like, no, we only talk about success here. And I'm like, well, no, we're in an abstract environment. We need to kind of start thinking, how do these negative outcomes still occur? Project cancelled because the funding was never secured, or project cancelled because it got too expensive. We're going through that in a couple of projects at the moment called Inland Rail and a few other things on the other side of Australia. So that, these environments do happen. So a pre-mortem, understanding where it could go wrong, is something that I actively kind of encourage as well. So when you're in the initiation stage, something we've talked about is heuristics. Why is heuristics such a big player in the initiation stage?
Well, what does heuristic mean? Actually, heuristic essentially means human man card. Means mental shortcuts, as in you do those quick decision makings without taking every piece of information with the high level of analytical rigor. As in, your brain is helping you make quick, effective decision makings, which is not essentially a bad thing. See, during daily life, we will have tons of decisions to make. If you can use those mental shortcuts to help you make quick, effective decision making, which is good to make your life easier. But the problem is that during the project initiation stage, as we mentioned, it's relatively very abstract stage. You don't have lots of information yet. You're trying to make the project more concrete. So there's a tendency for people to be optimism when they lack information. They always imagine the best case. But in that space, if you're using heuristics, using mental shortcuts to help you make decision, there's huge consequences later on if you are not using sufficient analytical rigor. So it is important because it is very abstract, it is quite uncertain. That's why analytical rigor plays a huge part in that. So we have to analyze all the information we have. You don't have lots of information there. So you have to make good use of all the information you already have to make analytical, rigorous decision making at the beginning.
Yeah. And acknowledging that you don't have all the information is sometimes the easiest way to overcome a heuristic. But how often do you hear or see someone, no, I don't have all the information, but this is what I have. And but most of the time people are required to stand up there with confidence and deliver that this will be delivered by this date and by this price in this location, even though they don't have the information to support that. They have to stand up there confidently, and because they've done that, that becomes the anchor.
As you mentioned, that's anchoring bias. Only because some stakeholder mentioned in the first meeting, mentioned a number or date, that's become a reference point later on. People will always come back to that as a reference, which may not be rigorously decided upon.
So we're going to dive into Perth Children's Hospital here. So in terms of the context, we went looking for a lot of information just to see what we could put together in terms of this episode. There wasn't a lot for the initiation space. From essentially, we've located the time frame that it occurred, which was from 2004 through to 2010-11, and that established a sequence of events that occurred during those times. But the outcome, we now have Perth Children's Hospital over near the QE2 environment, and we have a tertiary hospital that has the Children's Research Centre in there. It can also do the education and other elements of doctors in that space. We do have that now. As the capabilities delivering on point, it is doing what it needs to do. But the journey hasn't been a fun one. It hasn't been a smooth one, but the capability has been established. So it's been an effective one. Rule one of project management is be effective. Not necessarily. The moment you're not effective, it means you haven't been able to deliver on that particular project. However, so today I don't want to be diving too much into all of the history, the recent history. I want to dive back into what happened between 2004 and 2011. So in terms of the context, what do you know about Perth Children's Hospital from your perspective as being a Perth citizen here?
My limited understanding is that there was an old hospital there, and the facilities getting old cannot fulfill all the requirements of the sick children because children need more rooms to be treated. So that's why there's a need for children to be treated in a hospital setting, and the facility is getting old, and the community is looking for something new and bigger to support them. So that's why that's the promise from government. We're going to build a new hospital at the same location of that. That was my limited understanding to resolve the need of the community.
And you're pretty much on point, and it's a really important need. Having a children's hospital as part of a large community or a city that Perth is, as isolated as Perth is, the most isolated city in the world needs that Perth Children's Hospital. And we also had a very old children's hospital in Subiaco at the time that needed to be either upgraded or replaced. The government at the time decided, made a recommendation, and the time was 2004. And in the Reed report, which we've spoken about in terms of other episodes in Fiona Stanley Hospital, was also substantiated through this exact same report, 2004 Reed report, established that there is a need for a second tertiary hospital to be built for children's specific purposes. And yes, they did cross-pollinate a few other things into that space, and that initiated the conversation. How do you, we've identified a need. It's a capability. It's not an investment. It's not it's a capability for our community. How do we get this over the line? And that was the start in 2004. And the conversation went for many years. So in terms of the context, what we've been able to put together, there was a bit of journey across it. They were looking for a location to start with. The locations were between where Fiona Stanley Hospital is now, I think, next to the Mothers and Bubs Hospital, and straight up demolishing and replacing the current one in Subiaco. Where they landed was within the QE2, but that was a journey to get there. And who had the right recommendation for that location? Now, just the location. Okay, let's dive back into our other conversation about different groups think different areas are the right one. How do you decide that with the heuristics and available information what are some of the key things in location when you're determining a location for a project that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about biases in the initiation stage?
I think it's really a matter of project management team, how you have these initial conversations. I think one of the things quite important to have these initiation meetings, getting all the important stakeholders in the same room to having those rational conversations. What are the specific needs from different group? What do you want? What's expectations towards location of the hospital, and why do you want to achieve that? Just having those honest conversations. There's a capability called intellectual honesty. We want people in the room to be able to articulate their benefits well, and the project manager in the room should connect these benefits, and then having this conversation. Okay, then how do we decide on a mutually beneficial location that meets the requirements for all? I think just having this honest conversation at the beginning is quite important. We want to understand the needs from different groups, and from there, we want to make a rational decision for the project.
It is important to have that conversation. 100%. Where do you find it falls down? When you've seen some of those conversations in that initiation, where does that, you've got the people in the right room, where does it fall down?
Well, as you mentioned, psychological bias is one of the key reasons when you're having those sort of conversations, especially when we're talking about decisions such as building a children's hospital. We mentioned this is quite an emotionally charged conversation. There are sick children needing a hospital. There are aging facility needs to be rebuilt or something. There's a community needing this for a long time. So all of these factors making this conversation such a relatively emotional conversation. People are very excited about the project, people wanting the project to go ahead. I think this is a creative sort of a context where rational conversation can become difficult or challenging. I think when people are emotionally charged, most people will consider building a children's hospital now at this selected location is the only morally acceptable pathway to go, without people stand up to challenge. Oh, wait a minute. Is it really the right time to do it? Is it really the right location to do it? So the emotionally charged conversation problem making it a difficult, a challenging time for people to be able to bring in different ideas.
It is. And again, we don't have a lot of information on this particular project, but we're speculating in terms of what could have been happening in that environment. And you're right. It's an emotionally charged, morally charged project that, the community needed yesteryear. So there wasn't, they were talking about this project and it needed to be built as quickly as possible. The other element is then how do you facilitate that? And one of the contexts that I use is recording that information without an attachment or listening to understand. I've experienced in those initiation conversations that they're not there to listen to understand. They're there to go, we're doing this, get on board. And sometimes that's not the right approach. It actually delays it further. If you are compared to going in with that whole attitude of listen to understand and then pull everything together. You don't have to share too much, just put them in a room and listen to understand perspective. Have you seen that in an active environment?
Very often. I think, especially for some stakeholders who are strong mandate or strongly opinionated, if they think they have a well-developed plan, they will push that against all the stakeholders, making the conversation really difficult to move forward, making it challenging to have a constructive conversation. It's very often.
And sometimes when you're asking to bring the conversation back a stage to open other options or there's usually a pushback, and the pushback can come in multiple forms. It can come in, you no longer are required on this project. It could also come in with, you now need to work on this project over here. And so there's some context there that you do have to be aware of how the politics and all those things play. Like we're not there as righteous people saying this is how you do projects and this is the way you do projects. You still have to have a conscious mind on those elements that are at play. A lot of people forget about those and then get caught in the backwash of, you've stood up and you've said the wrong thing. Like, move over here. Not necessarily a bad thing. You just got to kind of be constructive in the way that you approach those situations. Have you ever had an experience where you've tried to say, hey, can we do this? And it's been good or bad?
I think it's challenging, especially when you are meeting with people, as you mentioned, with the titles, with high level of seniority or reputation. The problem becoming more and more challenging when you have different seniority people in the room. As you mentioned before, there's one type of bias called authority bias. As in when highly senior people propose a solution, it's very difficult for junior people to provide a different way of doing things or even to express their ideas. I think what is important in that situation is psychological safety. And we need to introduce this awareness of psychological bias so that we can create this safety environment for people to say things. I certainly see such an important thing for which to notice and such a critical area for which to grow into and being educated upon.
Yeah, and it is really hard to do.
It's really hard, yes.
And it takes people to lead into those environments with not necessarily what people used to call a vulnerability. But it's not a vulnerability, it's an established capability of an individual to lead and understand that people need to share in different ways. Some people will share 10 minutes after the meeting. They'll give you a full list and email of all the things that they would have stood to the sun, and you've got to be able to accept that as part of the process. Some will give you a full list before the meeting and say, this is what I want to talk about, and this is the only thing we're allowed to talk about. And as a leader in projects, you've got to be able to take the before, the during and the after and kind of bring them together in there, because that's how they feel safe communicating. And you've got to try and bring that back together.
As you mentioned, I think project leaders or leadership really play a key role in those sort of meetings or conversations. I think you want to demonstrate those supportive leadership, like those inclusive leadership, and to giving people space and room to express their ideas. Where does innovation come from? Innovation comes from when people feel safe to express their ideas, even though their ideas are not unpopular ideas. They need space and environment to be able to articulate themselves. That's the starting point of innovation. So I do think leadership plays a huge role and have a key responsibility in doing that. Especially senior leadership, they are responsible for creating this safe environment for people to do that. That's why I think only if we have this psychological safe environment, we can have those constructive, healthy conversations.
And we're talking more and more about psychological safety in the industry at large, but not enough. And we could do a lot more, not just in terms of making a work and health and safety element of are you okay, but what about the whole element of sharing, listening to understanding, and then accepting people for where they're at, not judging them on where they're at. And that's a tough element, part of the psychological safety conversation.
That needs awareness from people in the industry, people in the meeting, and people from the senior leadership. We need this high level of awareness of people to supporting that. Yeah, we have a long way to go.
We do, but we're on the move, which is good. And the elements that I'm seeing, that do have a lot of success, is when leaders ask open-ended questions rather than statements or leading with statements. And in project management, and if you ever find yourself in a leader position, I kind of challenge people to say, lead with an open-ended question. You never know what you're going to get an answer about, or the question may lead to another question that you never thought of. And that, that simple change of leading with open-ended questions and not having to be the person that solves it can do huge for psychological safety environment.
That's a quite structural skills people can use as well, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So we're moving into, we've got 2004, we've done the location, we've had these emotionally, morally charged conversations. We move into that, now we need to we've picked a location. Now we need to, what does that location represent? QE2. So the first time we saw, in terms of diving through the information, was the QE2 transport plan. And that was published in, I think it was early 2010. That generated some conversation because they were just trying to measure the distance or the how cars and how people would move through. But in that presentation, they actually released a schedule and the location and potential drawings of and high-level drawings of where QE2 was. And that was an interesting find for us when we were going through this. So we couldn't find too much about the actual business case build-up, but that was an interesting find. What did you take that there's publication in a transport plan, but not much else? What does that mean to you?
At that time, we don't have lots of information. That means that we have high level of ambiguity and high level of uncertainty, meaning that we need more rigorous decision-making to making sure that we make good use of every piece of information we have now, only because we don't have lots of information here. And meaning that we need to slow down the process, as in there's a tendency for us to make rusty decision makings on the limited information we have. So meaning that we need to slow down the decision making process and making sort of delayed decision making due to that. That's my understanding. If we don't have sufficient information at hand now, we can't rush the decision making.
It's very important, yes, not to rush the decision making, but when the decision's already made, in terms of the context, the location's made, the elements made in terms of what's going there, a children's hospital and a car park, with a schedule published. And then all of a sudden the public gets this information in that early 2010 space. The consultation, how do you demonstrate that this was the right place? How do you, when you're using taxpayers' money, that's kind of the question that kind of came out of it. And there's a lot of people that were for the QE2 location, and there were people that were like, oh, there's better locations than QE2. So in terms of what I remember, and you remember, this is me back in 2010 when and I went looking for some of the media of around that time. I couldn't find too much, but the context was that there wasn't a lot of information or context or sharing of how did they find that this decision was the right one. So they found themselves not only trying to plan a business case for 2011, but they were having to defend their decision. And because of that defense, it slowed the project down. So sometimes having a decision and then figuring things out to work to that decision in a backwards environment can actually set you up to struggle.
Of course. I think it's a huge step from trying to figure out the decision and trying to make a plan to the point that this decision is decided, it is approved. We just go go with it. I think there's a huge step in between. And then you can spot how the conversation shifted from we're trying to figure out a decision to we're trying to work with this defined decision, this sort of decided solution, huge conversations going on there. For example, you mentioned that there's a shift in language. People are starting to talk about, oh, are we actually doing this? How rational is the decision is to do this? Shift from this to how are we going to do this? What are the things we need to do this? The conversation has currently shifted from whether we want to do this to how we're going to do this. That's the shift in language when deciding whether this is the way to go. And then you see that the activity changed, starting from trying to collect more information so that you can make a rational decision whether we do this or not, changing to do more preparation work. Okay, now this is the plan. We're going to finish this until this time. This is the rough budget we're going to have. Doing this, we're going to have a world classic facility for Perth. From there, the activity changed from doing more preparation work. How do we make that happen? What sort of preparation we need so that we can make it happen? That's the activity change. That's the nature of the work being changed. Yes. And you can see that the risk, how people frame risk. Initially, people are thinking, are we doing this or not? So in any project, there are two options, right? We're doing this. We're not doing this. There are risks around each. There are risks of doing this, the risk of not doing this. And now the decision is announced. This is a public decision for doing that. So the risk framing becoming, okay, what are the risks of doing this? You see how the changes, how this shift people's mindset, planning, and even how people frame risks. It's a huge, I think it's a huge step in between.
It is a huge step. And the kind of element that we need to kind of address in some of the projects is what's called the captain's call. Have you heard this term where the person that's in charge gets to make the call? Yeah. And they make a call based on the information they have, and the heuristics of that is quite strong. So where do we stand in when we're talking about should we allow captain calls with infrastructure of this size? And should we allow certain elements to undertake that one? These are really good questions that need to be kind of asked in that process. We're committing significant amounts of taxpayers' money to projects in this way. Is the decision allowed to be made by a single person? Is the decision allowed to be made by a single group? Because these dollar amounts are not small. They're not. They do have consequences. They could be used for other things. And like you said, the consequence of doing nothing versus the consequences of doing something. There are different ways to kind of explore that. There are many case studies where people have made a decision really early on, and then the team behind the person says, look, we accept your decision, but in the politest, nicest way possible, there is a better option. And the biggest case study of this is actually the Pentagon in America. And if you ever want to dive into a case study of that, like where the location got changed based on a captain's call, and then the team behind them did the right thing and said, well, hang on, there's a better plot of land over here that suits everyone's need, that's a little bit less controversial. Can we entertain you for 2 weeks to try and demonstrate this? And sometimes challenging a captain's call is the right thing to do. And to be honest, I haven't seen a case study here in Perth or Australia yet where a captain's call has been challenged. The Pentagon is one where it was challenged, and it's a great case study to kind of read in and listen to. Have you ever seen a captain's call being challenged in any environment?
Well, I haven't seen many, to be honest. No.
And they're tough environments, like projects, captains are making the call because of the conversation got lost. That's kind of the reason why they want to make that decision, is like, well, we've got too many arguments on the table. How do we balance this out and find one? And my answer to that is prioritization. We shouldn't be just basing it on anecdotal, emotional and moral decisions. create a prioritization, create a multi-criteria assessment. We have the tools available these days to go, okay, this is option A, this is option B. If it's 40 criteria, if it's 4 criteria, at least do a multi-criteria assessment, and that can give you a base level of understanding.
Yeah, especially during the initial project initiation stage, where we mentioned earlier, there were limited information, everything is uncertain. Just spending the time to explore different options are quite important, rather than using some assumptions or earlier premature decisions to guide the conversation.
There is a lot of tools available now for project managers, like the MCA multi-criteria assessment is one. You've got risk registers and Monte Carlo simulations for both cost and schedule. We can run 10,000 iterations of a program, and it's cheap to do in terms of when you're comparing what it would take to do that analysis, Monte Carlo analysis, versus the cost of a project. We're talking $1 billion versus tens of thousands of dollars. Hire someone in, do your Monte Carlo assessment, get your understanding of both your schedule and cost, and have that as a known. It's still subjective. It's still not factual information, but it's better than nothing.
Yes.
And sometimes people need to challenge themselves and say, what do I have? What actual information do I have? Rather than just accepting what's in front of them and then making a decision.
Yeah, as you mentioned, this is a huge commitment. So before doing that, we need rigorous analysis to making sure that we know what are we actually committing to. Yeah.
So we're moving into that like last element. We're moving from the location secured, the parking lot and the location has been promoted. We're in QE2, and the final artifact in terms of what we're talking about in initiation was the submission of the business case to Parliament. Now, it was approved in Parliament in 2011. There's a very slight difference here. That was the first time it was approved to actually progress. What are your thoughts on about what you were saying earlier, the actual sharing of knowledge so that people understand how you get there? What happened there in that context? What do you think happened?
I think from the process of we making decision of whether we should do this or not, to the point that the proposal is being approved by the government, I think there are huge steps in between. And I think sometimes it's counterintuitive, as in the uncertainty is the same all the time. It's always uncertain. But the moment that the project is being approved, sort of making the decision, making the uncertainty more emotionally tolerable. As in sometimes it can feel like a relief. Okay, the decision is being approved. Now we no longer need to decide whether we should do this or not, changing into the mindset of how we do this. I think the level of uncertainty is always there. Just the action of being approved, making the decision more risk tolerable, feels like this is more tolerable uncertainty for us. Yeah, I think it's a key point of how the conversation, all the efforts are being shaped towards the later stage of the project.
Yeah. So there's also another element now that is starting to play in projects, is that whatever gets published in terms of number and schedule, the general public go, well, that's never going to happen. So, there is a fear amongst, do we release an estimate now and a schedule, or, and then commit to that? Or should we start looking at trying to find a different way to communicate this process to the general public? Do you have any potential opinion on that? Like, should we be trying to improve how we communicate our projects?
Well, I think that's another aspect where anchoring bias could kick in. As in, from the moment where the project's being approved, it's almost like you anchored the idea into the public's mind. Into the public's mindset, or even the stakeholders' mindset. People having this idea, okay, we are building this world-class world-class facility, children's hospital, and we are providing these benefits to sick children, providing benefits to the local community, and we are doing this, and we're going to deliver this in certain time. It's already put a reference in the public's mind, and this also a huge anchor to the project management team as well. So they almost feels like these are achievable. When you do the project planning, after you put things into figures, into a Gantt chart, you're using those box to indicate the time, how we do this. All of this uncertain suddenly sounds like more reliable and more validated. I think there's a huge psychological bias happening there, to making people involved in the project sort of trusting that we can actually do this. I think it's a way how the conversation is shifted. People feels like we are doing this, we are delivering this by 2015, but by the end of the delivery date.
This was the plan. In 2011, it was going to be delivered by 2015 and for $1.1 billion.
Yeah.
We've only just seen the end of it in 2022 after the court cases at a potential, it's not confirmed, cost of about 1.9 billion. And there was a lot of, potential elements that happened throughout the journey. So as a project, what are some of the key lessons that, project managers should take from the Princess Margaret? So, diving into those lessons learned, what do you think in that initiation stage should future project managers really take?
Well, I think what is project management? Project management is a good structured decision-making, which is especially important at the project initiation stage. We really need, we said this many times already, we really need to get the right people in the room to having those rational conversations, to discuss what are we actually committing to do, to having those realistic conversations, not a conversation is idealized conversation to get the project approved. Really realistic conversations. What are the risks? Are we potentially discussing about? To having those conversations to make sure people are on the same page is quite important. And we need those intellectual honesty to making sure that different stakeholders or different people are able, feel safe to articulate their ideas. I think this is key responsibility for project managers in managing the project, to build those structural governance at the early stage to make sure that people have the opportunity to contribute in as time goes by.
So I'm going to follow that with a question. How should those future project managers be focusing on now? How do they learn more about what you've just said?
I think one thing we discussed not enough two things actually we discussed not enough. One is emotions, the role of emotion in project management. I think future project manager needs to recognize and be aware of the importance of emotion in project management. How do you manage, regulate emotion, not only yours, but also the emotions of people in your team? How do you recognize when people are making decisions which are emotionally driven, are not rational? That's the first thing. The second thing is be aware of psychological bias. Having a basic understanding of potential different psychological bias, which might creep in and affect rational decision making, and to be aware of the early signals of that, and then using either structural intervention or using a external help, hiring an independent auditor in your team to help you to mitigate the effective psychological bias as much as possible. So two things I think I want to raise attention to future project managers. One is how to manage emotions. Two is psychological bias.
Yeah, and it's really important. I've only probably woken up to it probably in the last 12 months, and I've been in projects for 15 years, and waking up to that emotional element of a project or what's happening within the team really came relevant when I felt really attached to a project. I was committed and attached, which kind of made me feel that I needed to do more and more into that project. And then why are they not listening to me? Those elements. And since I've reverted back to I'm committed,